The unit itself, The American Dream, Then and Now, it spans 6 weeks, and it is actually the introduction unit at the beginning of the junior year in English. I think it's important to introduce this early on in the year, and I really took early on to the beginning, like first 6 weeks, because it's something that's going to run through all the American literature read in junior year, and laying down a really solid foundation and letting students connect with the American Dream will help them stay involved during the year. So the main idea is just that students will be introduced to the American Dream, and they'll have to formulate their own definitions about what it used to mean, as in probably about as far back as the 20s. I doubt we'll go further back than that, but also what it means now. And their understanding of the concept will be shaped by their own knowledge, popular culture that they're obviously familiar with, and the traditional literature that we're going to study. In this study, the students will also be able to search for literary devices and analyzing their purposes, so it doesn't really shift away from the traditional literacies entirely, because those things do need to be developed. As much as I can say we focus too much on testing, they still need to pass the Regents at the end of junior year, so they need to be able to identify those things. But if I can make it interesting and exciting and relevant, then it's going to be a whole lot easier to do it. So the actual unit runs from September 8th to October 20th, and that's the main idea of the unit. The first lesson is on, I believe, the first day of school, possibly the third, after they have a couple days to, adjust to life. And this is the one where, they'll discuss what the American Dream is, and in groups they'll compare their answers and we'll make a group definition. What's exciting about this one is the body of the lesson, and I did this with a slight variance at Charlotte, as I've mentioned a number of times now. And basically you let kids sit at a different group and listen to a song, whether it's, if the video's there, that's great and that'll help. If not, you still have the song. So what the students do is they get to read it and then figure out what they're saying about the American Dream. This can be done specific with guided questions, or it can be more general and just like, what did the song say about the American Dream? It really depends on the level of your class or the students or how you feel comfortable with that. But then they get to compare and contrast what these 3 songs said about the American Dream themselves. So the cool thing about this is that it gives them multiple contemporary perspectives from people that they know or are familiar with, and through music. It's a number of multi-literacies, and they're all kind of exciting. And as a conclusion, as a ticket out the door, it's a little silly, but they're asked to draw a picture of their personal American Dream, and they can only use 3 words to clarify their image. I felt that this was important because students need to be able to express themselves multimodally, but it also forces them to narrow down what they're doing. So they cannot sit there and write a paragraph out about what they think. If they need to be able to show it. And it's just a way to get them to think around their ideas more fully. And for homework, they have to find an example in the media of the American Dream as it is right now. So they can bring it in or describe it, and then we can talk about that because it helps to further develop the ideas. There's a number of different multi-literacies, obviously, that go with this. The ones I've mentioned prior, a number of other things like personal understanding, evaluation, the ability to combine ideas, which comes up frequently, and it's not something that's often considered a literacy, but I think it's important. If you have 2 different ideas and you need to bring them together to synthesize something new, I see that as being a literacy, and a very important one at that. The assessments during this lesson focus on combining knowledge from the entire class to create a picture that the students will remember. So they're asked to further extrapolate on those ideas on their own, so they get a general idea, but then they can expand at home. The students also have the next day to get further acclimated with the American Dream and the classroom procedures before really getting into the first literary work. They'll also have September 12th to be introduced to literary elements and such, because these things really do need to be introduced. You can't just drop a student into analyzing poetry. The American Dream poetry, I was sort of torn about putting this in here because poetry is hard. There's no 2 ways about it. Poetry is hard. But the students will play a review game to review their understanding of, poetic devices and other literary devices. But then they'll be split into 5 groups, and each one will be given a poem that were mentioned earlier that espouses ideas that relate to the American Dream. And basically they have to analyze the poem in the group and determine the theme based on the text, and a small amount of biographical information provided to them if available. Some of the poems that were chosen were less famous and more personalized, so it may be harder to get information for those authors. Regardless, it still functions. So the students will be able to draw from the practice of analyzing the lyrics from a few days before. So then they get to analyze the text. And then at the conclusion, each group will read their poem, explain its opinion in literary devices. And then this begins the day where we will pin one copy of the poem with the explanation onto the American Dream display. So on the display, half of it will be pro-American Dream, half of it will be con, and I'm willing to allow for a pretty sizable in-between chunk where it falls, further one way than the other, but it's definitely not polarized. This will also give the kids a visual example and reminder of what we've done, so it helps them to further understand and to recollect when necessary. Again, number of multiliteracies, they use technology, they use their poetic knowledge and analysis and group work, all of these things. Basically, the use of group work helps to scaffold them as they're working with poetry because it's such a difficult medium. By creating a visual display that shows the varying opinions of the American Dream, the students are not only collaboratively defining the term, but coming to understand it in many contexts, and then displaying that visually, which is pretty cool because they can always go to look back at it. They'll spend the rest of the week evaluating American poetry, looking at it from other perspectives, and using visual representations like the YouTube videos I mentioned before. The next lesson actually deals with introducing the Roaring Twenties and the Great Gatsby. I thought it'd be cool to integrate art here because I love art. I'm not super knowledgeable, but I think it's really cool. So the students will have 4 different posters of famous artwork from the 20s, and then they will also have a list of 20s slang. So it's sort of a silly introduction activity, but it's a fun way to get used to using the lingo because they'll have to write a sentence about each poster using some of the 20s slang. Now, again, it may not be totally life relevant, but it's a fun way to get excited about the text and the era entirely. Then the students will be brought to the computer lab and they're going to complete the Great Gatsby web quest. Obviously, they're not going to be able to do an entire web quest in one day, so they'll each do a section and then they'll confer with each other about it, sort of gathering the information that they had missed. And then ultimately, at the end of the class, they'll pair up. They'll compare the American Dream of the 20s and the American Dream of today that we worked so hard to establish. And then half of the class will write down things that they believe have remained the same, consistent in the American Dream, and others will write things that have changed. So then they can, create large lists and they compare their lists, and it's pretty cool because then they see how some things have remained consistent but some things have changed. The nice thing about this one is the homework, because they're going to read the first chapter of Great Gatsby and they'll have to complete an online setting organizer on the classroom web page. All the students will be required to contribute to the organizer adding information about East Egg and West Egg or about the character attributes of the main characters introduced. I think it's very cool to follow the characters because they are what make the story, and especially in this case, so they can choose between those, and having this online repository of information also ends up creating great review material. It appeals to a number of multiliteracies. They're listed there. The web quest allows the students to be in charge of their own learning, as I mentioned before. The group work allows them to fill in the gaps. The homework forces them to graphically consider the characters and settings, so they need to be able to put this into chart form. I don't want sentence after sentence after sentence. I want it to be brought down to the bare bones so they can look at it and immediately just be reminded of things. Throughout September, the students will be reading one chapter of Great Gatsby for each class period, and homework will always consist of online contributions to organizers or discussion. Not necessarily the same one, but something like that. And they'll use this time to develop a clear image of the 1920s and the intangibility of the American Dream. After they complete the novel, they will have 2 days to work on a traditional essay, writing both in and out of class. I can't emphasize enough how much students really need to be writing in general, and that's why I do consistently put essays such as this in there, because if they are not familiar with writing like this, they will not be able to pass the exam, and ultimately that is the kind of success we need.